Emma thought she knew everything about her husband, until a shocking secret shattered her world. Left with only questions, she embarks on a heart-wrenching journey of love, loss, and unexpected redemption. Will Emma find the strength to rebuild her life and fight for the boy who could change everything? The morning light stretched across the quiet farm, casting long shadows as Emma stood by the window, her coffee in hand. She watched Mike working in the distance, his figure moving steadily through the fields. Their life on the farm had always been calm, but lately, something felt off. Emma couldn't ignore the way Mike locked his office door every night or how their once lively conversations had dwindled into small, practical exchanges about the farm. Though they shared the same space, the silence between them had grown, making Emma wonder what Mike was hiding. It wasn't just the office door that bothered her. Mike's behavior had shifted subtly over time. He became more withdrawn, secretive even. Nights where he'd leave the house for hours claiming to tend to something in the barn had become more frequent, and though Emma was tempted to ask questions, she held back. Every time she considered confronting him, fear of the unknown kept her silent. One evening, she finally asked about the locked office, but Mike's dismissive response only deepened her unease. The answer he gave, just work stuff, felt more like an excuse than the truth. As days turned into weeks, the tension built, though neither of them acknowledged it openly. Emma continued with her routines, tending to the house and gardens, while Mike worked the fields. Yet, the distance between them was palpable, like an invisible wall growing higher with each passing day. Emma couldn't help but feel that something important was slipping away, and though she tried to ignore it, the creeping sense of unease refused to leave her. One afternoon, while chatting with her neighbor Kate, Emma heard words that struck her deeply. "Secrets are no friend to a marriage," Kate said casually, unaware of the impact they had on Emma. Those words echoed in Emma's mind long after their conversation ended. Though she tried to brush it off, Emma knew there was a truth in them that she couldn't ignore. She had sensed for a while that Mike was keeping something from her. His reluctance to discuss their future and the constant secrecy around his locked office were clear signs. The more she thought about it, the more she realized it was only a matter of time before those secrets surfaced. As days passed, Emma's mind circled around the idea that something was terribly wrong. Mike's behavior, once something she brushed aside, now felt like a ticking time bomb. His silence, the avoidance of certain topics, and the ever-present locked door weighed heavily on her heart. Deep down, she wondered how long their marriage could withstand the strain of hidden truths. Although she never considered confronting him before, the unease within her grew stronger each day. Sooner or later, she knew she would have to face whatever Mike was hiding. Late one afternoon, after hours of watching Mike move between the fields and his office, Emma noticed something unusual. Mike had left in a rush, forgetting to lock the office door behind him. Emma stared at the slightly ajar door for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. It was the moment she had been both dreading and waiting for. She knew she shouldn't invade his privacy, but the weight of the unanswered questions had become too much to bear. With a deep breath, she crossed the room and, with shaky hands, pushed the door open. Inside the office, papers were scattered across the desk, along with a few notebooks, but something else quickly caught her attention. A single letter lay open on top of the clutter, its heading from an orphanage. Emma's eyes widened as she read the first few lines. It spoke of a child, Mike's child. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could feel the blood rushing to her ears as the reality of what she was reading sank in. Mike had a son, and she had never known. How could he have hidden something this huge from her? The words blurred on the page as Emma's mind raced, replaying every moment of the past few months in a new, harsh light. The locked door, the late nights, the tension between them, it all made sense now. But this was more than she ever imagined. She sank into the chair, the letter still in her trembling hands, and felt her world shatter. A wave of betrayal washed over her, leaving her breathless and shaking. How could Mike keep this secret from her, after all their years together? Just as the enormity of the discovery hit her, Emma heard the front door close. Mike was back. Panic surged through her veins, and she hastily stood, stuffing the letter back onto the desk. She barely had time to compose herself before Mike appeared in the doorway. His eyes immediately went to the open letter, and his face paled. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating, as Mike's gaze met Emma's. "Emma, I can explain," he began, but his voice faltered under the weight of the truth. Emma's voice cracked as she spoke, her words filled with hurt. "Why didn't you tell me? You've been hiding this from me all this time?" Mike took a step forward, his hand reaching out in desperation, but Emma stepped back, shaking her head. The hurt in her eyes was unmistakable. The confrontation had begun, and though Emma had found the answers she sought, the consequences were more devastating than she had ever anticipated. The air between them crackled with tension as Emma stared at Mike, waiting for an explanation that could somehow make sense of the betrayal she felt. "I didn't know how to tell you," Mike began, his voice shaky, eyes filled with regret. He tried to approach her, but Emma backed away, shaking her head. "You didn't know how to tell me you had a son? Mike, how could you hide something like this from me?" Her voice wavered, a mixture of anger and heartbreak spilling out as the reality of their situation became too much to bear. Mike lowered his gaze, struggling to find the right words. "It was before us, Emma. I thought it was something that would stay in the past. I never wanted to hurt you." But his words felt hollow to Emma, unable to soothe the ache that had taken root in her chest. "Stay in the past?" she repeated, incredulous. "You locked part of your life away, and now I'm supposed to just accept that?" The disbelief and pain were clear in her voice as she stepped closer to him, her hands trembling at her sides. "I thought I was protecting you," Mike continued, but Emma couldn't listen anymore. "Protecting me? Or protecting yourself?" she snapped, her voice rising with every word. "I thought we didn't have secrets, Mike. I thought we were in this together." Tears filled her eyes as the words poured out, and the truth she had been avoiding for so long finally came to light. She had felt the distance growing between them, but never imagined it was because of a secret like this. The weight of Mike's deceit pressed heavily on her heart, suffocating the trust they once shared. Before Mike could respond, his face twisted in pain, his hands suddenly clutching his chest. Emma's anger vanished in an instant, replaced by fear. "Mike," she whispered, her voice shaking. He stumbled, his breath coming in shallow gasps, before collapsing to the floor. Emma's heart raced as she dropped to her knees beside him, her hands frantically reaching for him. "Mike, no! Stay with me," she cried, her voice filled with panic as she fumbled for her phone to call for help. Emma dialed for an ambulance, her fingers trembling as she pleaded for them to hurry. But by the time they arrived, it was too late. Despite her desperate attempts to keep him alive, Mike's heart had stopped. The paramedics tried to revive him, but there was nothing they could do. Mike was gone, and Emma was left with the crushing weight of loss, realizing that the confrontation they had just shared would be their last. The days following Mike's death were a blur for Emma. The funeral was small and quiet, just as Mike would have wanted, with only a few close neighbors in attendance. Standing by the graveside, Emma felt the weight of not only her grief but also the unresolved questions that Mike had left behind. As she watched the coffin being lowered into the ground, her mind kept returning to the letter she had found in his office. Mike was gone, but the secret of his child remained, haunting her even in her mourning. She knew she couldn't ignore it. After the funeral, the house felt emptier than ever. The silence that once hovered between them now enveloped everything, pressing down on her like a heavy fog. Each day, Emma would find herself standing in front of Mike's locked office door, remembering the letter and the name written on it, Ethan. She had no idea who the boy was, where he lived, or how to even begin finding him. But something inside her wouldn't let it go. She owed it to Mike, to herself, to uncover the truth about this child who had been hidden from her all these years. Emma finally gathered the courage to open the door to Mike's office once again. The letter lay exactly where she had left it, a silent reminder of the life Mike had kept secret. As she read it over once more, the name of the orphanage stood out to her. It was the only lead she had. With shaking hands, she picked up the phone and dialed the number at the top of the letter. The voice on the other end was polite, but guarded, as Emma asked about Ethan. They couldn't provide her with much information, but they confirmed that Mike had been involved with the boy's case. Days turned into nights, and Emma found herself diving deeper into the mystery of Ethan. She couldn't shake the feeling that this boy was now part of her story, too, a thread left behind by Mike for her to follow. She didn't know what she would find, but she knew she had to try. Mike's death had left her with more questions than answers, and this was the only way she could begin to make sense of it all. There was no turning back now. With a mixture of dread and determination, Emma made a decision. She would find Ethan, no matter what it took. The life she thought she knew had been shattered, and now, the only way forward was to confront the past that Mike had kept hidden. As she stepped outside, the wind stirred the trees, and for the first time in days, Emma felt a small spark of purpose ignite within her. She was going to uncover the truth, even if it led her down a path she could never have expected. Emma's search for Ethan took her to the orphanage mentioned in the letter. It was a small, unassuming building on the edge of town, a place she had never noticed before. Walking inside, she was met with the smell of fresh paint and the soft hum of children's voices. A woman behind the front desk greeted her with a polite smile, though her eyes were filled with curiosity. "I'm here to ask about Ethan," Emma said, her voice wavering slightly. The woman hesitated but eventually nodded, disappearing into the back room to retrieve a file. When the woman returned, she explained that Ethan was indeed the child Mike had been in contact with for years. He was a sweet boy, only 8 years old, but had been dealt a difficult hand. Emma's heart sank as she learned that Ethan had a congenital heart condition, something that required constant medical attention and, eventually, a costly surgery. As the woman spoke, Emma could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had come to find answers, but instead, she had found a responsibility she never anticipated. Emma met Ethan later that day. He was sitting in the orphanage's small playroom, his face lighting up when the door opened. There was an innocence in his smile, a brightness that seemed to contrast the severity of his condition. "Hi, I'm Emma," she introduced herself, feeling an unexpected warmth toward the boy. They sat together, talking about simple things, his favorite games, his favorite foods, but beneath their conversation, Emma felt something much deeper forming. She couldn't quite put it into words, but it was as if she had been meant to find him. As their visits continued, Emma found herself growing more attached to Ethan. She would bring him little gifts, take him on walks around the orphanage grounds, and listen to his stories. Despite his illness, Ethan had a joyful spirit that reminded her of simpler times, before the secrets, before the grief. It became clear to Emma that Mike had cared deeply for this boy, and now, it seemed that his care had been passed on to her. The more time she spent with Ethan, the more she began to feel that adopting him was not just a possibility, it was a calling. However, the reality of Ethan's condition loomed large. The surgery he needed was expensive, and the orphanage didn't have the funds to cover it. Emma found herself at a crossroads, torn between her growing love for the boy and the overwhelming challenges that lay ahead. Could she really take on this responsibility, especially after everything she had been through with Mike? But as she looked into Ethan's hopeful eyes, Emma knew one thing for sure: she couldn't walk away from him now. Emma's bond with Ethan grew stronger with each passing day. Determined to give him the joy and freedom of childhood, she began taking him out on small trips around the countryside. They would visit the local park, walk along the riverbank, and even stop by the farm, where Ethan's eyes would light up at the sight of the animals. Despite his condition, Ethan had a boundless energy that seemed to lift Emma's spirits. His laughter filled the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma began to feel a sense of purpose beyond her grief. One afternoon, as they sat by the river, Ethan pointed to a tree where birds were nesting. "I wish I could climb that tree," he said wistfully, his gaze following the birds as they fluttered in and out of the branches. Emma smiled and ruffled his hair. "Maybe one day," she replied softly, though the unspoken reality of his condition hung between them. Still, she couldn't help but admire Ethan's optimism. It was as if, despite everything he had been through, he carried a light that refused to dim. During these moments, Emma realized how much Ethan had brought back into her life. His presence was a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there could still be joy. As they spent more time together, she began to imagine what life could be like if she adopted him. She could see a future where Ethan became part of her world, a world that had once felt so empty after Mike's death. And though the decision weighed heavily on her, the time she spent with Ethan only made her feel more certain that this was the right path. But life was not without its challenges. One evening, as Emma was preparing dinner, she received a phone call that shook her to her core. Her mother, whom she had been estranged from for years, had passed away. The news hit her like a tidal wave, reopening old wounds and bringing back memories she had long buried. It felt like the universe had given her Ethan as a light in her life, only to cast another shadow over her with the loss of her mother. Yet, as she sat with the news, Emma found herself more resolved than ever to give Ethan the love and stability she had once lacked. The next time Emma saw Ethan, she held him a little tighter, feeling the weight of both grief and hope in her heart. She hadn't yet told him about her decision to adopt him, but deep down, she knew it was the right thing to do. Ethan had become a bright spot in her life, a reason to keep going, and she was determined to be there for him, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. And though the road would be difficult, Emma knew that together, they could face whatever came their way. The news of her mother's death lingered in Emma's mind, casting a shadow over her thoughts even as she tried to focus on Ethan. Days after the funeral, she was called to meet with her mother's lawyer regarding the estate. Emma hadn't expected much, her relationship with her mother had been strained for years. But as she sat in the lawyer's office, she was stunned to learn that she had inherited a substantial amount of money. It was a bittersweet revelation, a gift from someone who had been absent from her life for so long. As Emma walked out of the office, the weight of her emotions pressed down on her, but a single thought rose above the rest: Ethan. The money could cover the cost of Ethan's surgery, something that had seemed impossible just days before. Emma knew what she had to do. Without hesitation, she began making arrangements, calling specialists, researching the best hospitals, and preparing for the next steps. The inheritance, which had initially felt like a burden, now became a lifeline for Ethan. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a sense of control over the future. She could finally provide for him in the way Mike would have wanted, and the thought brought her a sense of peace amidst the chaos. Emma returned to the orphanage the following day with a renewed sense of purpose. She had made her decision: she would adopt Ethan. The boy's face lit up as she shared the news with him, his eyes wide with excitement and disbelief. "Really?" he asked, his voice full of hope. "You're really going to be my mom?" Emma smiled, her heart swelling with love for the boy. "Yes, Ethan. I'm going to be your mom," she said softly, kneeling down to his level. The words felt right, and for the first time since Mike's death, Emma felt like she was building something meaningful again. As the adoption process moved forward, Emma and Ethan grew even closer. They spent every moment they could together, and Emma found herself laughing more, smiling more, and feeling the weight of her grief lift with each passing day. But the decision to adopt Ethan came with new challenges. There were endless forms to fill out, meetings with social workers, and the ever-present reality of his health looming over them. Still, Emma remained determined. She had come too far to turn back now. With the paperwork in motion and the surgery scheduled, Emma felt a sense of relief, though the road ahead was still uncertain. The money from her mother's inheritance had provided the means to give Ethan the care he needed, but it couldn't erase the fear that lingered in her heart. Yet, despite the challenges, Emma knew she had made the right choice. She had found hope again in Ethan, and together, they were ready to face whatever the future held. As the day of Ethan's surgery approached, the weight of Emma's decisions began to press down on her. The adoption process was in motion, but it wasn't without complications. Legal challenges began to arise, questions about Emma's suitability as a single mother, concerns over Ethan's health, and the bureaucratic obstacles that seemed to multiply each day. Emma found herself in and out of meetings with lawyers and social workers, each conversation reminding her just how difficult this path was going to be. Yet, even as the challenges mounted, she refused to give up. But just when Emma thought things couldn't get more complicated, an unexpected figure reappeared, Lauren, Ethan's biological mother. Emma had never expected to meet her, and when Lauren showed up demanding to see her son, it sent Emma's world into a tailspin. Lauren had disappeared years ago, leaving Ethan in the care of the orphanage, and now she was back, threatening to challenge Emma for custody. "I'm his mother," Lauren said, her voice sharp with anger. "You can't just take him from me." Emma's heart sank. She had feared this moment, and now it was here. The tension between them was palpable. Lauren's sudden reappearance left Emma questioning everything: her right to adopt Ethan, her ability to protect him, and whether she could fight this battle alone. But what hurt the most was seeing the confusion in Ethan's eyes. He didn't understand why this woman, who had abandoned him, was now claiming to want him back. "I don't want to go with her," Ethan whispered to Emma one night, his voice small and scared. Emma hugged him tightly, her own fears bubbling just beneath the surface. "I won't let her take you," she promised, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed the weight of the situation. The legal battle that followed was intense and exhausting. Lauren's sudden return brought with it a storm of complications, both emotional and legal. The orphanage, caught in the middle, was unsure how to proceed. Emma found herself fighting for Ethan in ways she hadn't anticipated, every day feeling like an uphill battle. The fear of losing him, after all they had been through, gnawed at her constantly. It wasn't just about the surgery anymore, it was about keeping the family she had begun to build from being torn apart. As the court date loomed, Emma's resolve wavered, but she refused to let it break her. She had come too far to lose Ethan now. But the pressure was relentless, and every day brought new anxieties. Lauren was determined to reclaim her son, and though Emma didn't fully understand her motives, she knew one thing: she would fight with everything she had to keep Ethan in her life. But as the days passed, the fear that she might lose him, both to his health and to the legal battle, weighed heavily on her heart. The day Emma had been dreading arrived sooner than expected. The doctors informed her that Ethan's condition had worsened dramatically, and the surgery needed to be moved up. The urgency in their voices filled Emma with a sense of dread she hadn't felt in a long time. "We need to operate within the week," the surgeon explained, his expression grave. Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, but inside, she felt like she was losing control. Ethan's health was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As if that weren't enough, the custody battle with Lauren had intensified. Lauren's lawyers were pushing for an emergency hearing to determine Ethan's fate before the surgery. The pressure was unbearable. Every phone call, every letter from the courts felt like another blow. Emma felt trapped between two impossible situations: on one side, the fight to keep Ethan alive, and on the other, the fight to keep him with her. "How can this be happening all at once?" she whispered to herself one evening, the weight of it all crashing down on her as she sat alone in the kitchen. Ethan, unaware of the full extent of what was happening, sensed the tension. "Am I going to be okay?" he asked one night, his small voice cutting through Emma's spiraling thoughts. She forced a smile, gently brushing the hair from his forehead. "You're going to be fine, sweetheart," she whispered, though the fear gnawed at her from the inside. She couldn't let him see how scared she was. But deep down, Emma felt like everything was slipping out of her hands. She was powerless against the forces pulling Ethan away from her. Both his illness and the court battle loomed over them like a dark cloud. The court hearing was scheduled for 2 days before Ethan's surgery. Emma's nerves were frayed as she walked into the courtroom, Lauren sitting across from her with a cold, determined expression. The hearing felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. The judge listened as both sides presented their cases, but the uncertainty of it all hung in the air like a ticking clock. Emma's mind was split between the legal arguments and the thought of Ethan lying in a hospital bed, waiting for the surgery that might save his life. The weight of it all became unbearable. When the judge announced that the decision would be delayed, Emma's heart sank. There was no resolution, no clarity, and worst of all, no time. Ethan's surgery was imminent, and she still didn't know if she would lose him to Lauren, or if he would even survive the procedure. As she left the courtroom, the world felt as though it was closing in on her. Everything she had fought for was slipping away, and Emma found herself standing on the edge of an abyss, unsure of how to move forward. In the quiet of the night, Emma sat alone in the hospital waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly as she waited for news about Ethan's surgery. The hospital lights flickered softly overhead, but all Emma could focus on was the growing knot of fear in her chest. The legal battle, the endless obstacles, it all felt like too much. She was utterly exhausted, both physically and emotionally. For the first time, Emma let the tears fall, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She had tried to stay strong, but in this moment, she felt completely and utterly lost. The questions that had haunted her for weeks now consumed her. Was she even meant to be Ethan's mother? Had she made the right decisions, or had she rushed into something too big, too overwhelming to handle? Her grief for Mike, the looming presence of Lauren, and the fragile health of Ethan swirled in her mind like a storm she couldn't escape. Every doubt, every fear, resurfaced in the stillness of the night. "What if I lose him?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the empty room. The thought of losing Ethan, after everything they had been through together, was unbearable. To distract herself, Emma pulled out her phone and scrolled through pictures she had taken with Ethan over the past few weeks. Each image, each smile, reminded her of the joy he had brought back into her life. She stopped on a photo of them by the river, Ethan's face lit up with laughter as he pointed at the birds. The memory of that day stirred something inside her, a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. Ethan had given her a reason to fight again, a reason to keep going, even when everything seemed impossible. As the night dragged on, Emma closed her eyes and let herself drift back through the memories of the past months. Mike's death, the discovery of Ethan, the bond they had formed, it all led her here, to this moment. She had faced challenges she never thought she could handle, yet she was still standing. Somehow, despite all the pain, Ethan had become her reason to hope again. And in that moment, Emma realized something. No matter how dark things seemed, she wasn't going to give up on him. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. With a deep breath, Emma wiped away her tears. She wasn't alone in this fight, Ethan needed her, and she needed him. The fear and uncertainty still lingered, but beneath it all, a new sense of resolve began to take shape. She had made mistakes, she had doubted herself, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let go of the life she had built with Ethan. They were a family now, and Emma would fight for that with everything she had. The morning of Ethan's surgery arrived, and with it, a renewed sense of determination in Emma. After spending a sleepless night reflecting on everything that had brought her to this point, she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let Ethan face this alone. She had made a promise to herself, and to Mike, that she would protect this boy with everything she had. No matter the legal challenges, no matter the uncertainty of his health, Emma was prepared to fight for Ethan's life and their future together. She walked into the hospital with her head held high, resolved to see this through. Before the surgery, Emma sat with Ethan in his hospital room, holding his small hand in hers. "You're going to be okay, Ethan," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear still lingering in her heart. Ethan looked up at her with trust in his eyes, giving her a faint smile. "I'm not scared," he said quietly. His bravery struck Emma deeply, and in that moment, she realized just how strong he was. This wasn't just her fight, it was theirs. They were in this together, and Emma wasn't going to let anything tear them apart. As Ethan was wheeled into surgery, Emma made a promise to herself: she would do whatever it took to keep him in her life. She had already contacted the best specialists, and with the inheritance from her mother, she had the resources to give Ethan the care he needed. But there was still the matter of the custody battle with Lauren. Emma had decided to use every penny of the inheritance if necessary, hiring the best legal team to ensure that Ethan remained with her. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him now, not after all they had been through together. With the surgery underway, Emma paced the waiting room, her mind racing with possibilities. She had already taken the first steps by scheduling another court hearing, determined to prove that she was the best person to care for Ethan. She had gathered testimonies from the orphanage, from doctors, and from friends who had seen the bond she shared with the boy. No matter what Lauren's intentions were, Emma knew she was the one who truly understood Ethan's needs and had the ability to provide for him. Hours passed, and finally, the surgeon emerged from the operating room. Emma's heart stopped as she searched his face for an answer. The surgeon smiled gently, his eyes tired but reassuring. "The surgery went well," he said. Emma let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, tears filling her eyes. Ethan had made it through. The relief was overwhelming, but Emma knew that their journey wasn't over yet. There were still battles to be fought, but in that moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight lift, just a little, as she prepared for the next step in their fight for a future together. The day of the final court hearing arrived, and Emma walked into the courtroom with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in months. This was it, the moment that would decide Ethan's future. She had spent weeks preparing, gathering every piece of evidence she could to prove that she was the best person to care for him. Lauren sat across the room, her expression cold and distant, but Emma didn't let it shake her. She knew the truth of the bond she and Ethan shared, and she was ready to fight for it. As the hearing began, both sides presented their cases. Lauren's lawyer spoke of her right as Ethan's biological mother, her desire to make amends for the years she had been absent. But as Emma listened, she couldn't help but feel that Lauren's words were hollow. She had been gone for so long, and now, only after hearing about Ethan's health and the financial inheritance, did she suddenly want to reclaim her son. When it was Emma's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice steady as she explained the love and care she had given Ethan. "I've been there for him through every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night, every moment of fear," she said, her eyes meeting the judge's. "I love him like my own, and I will continue to fight for him with everything I have." The courtroom was silent as the judge deliberated, the tension thick in the air. Emma's heart pounded as she waited for the decision. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice calm but firm. "In light of the evidence presented, and considering the best interests of the child, custody is awarded to Emma Carter." The words washed over Emma like a wave of relief. She had done it. She had won. Lauren's expression hardened, but Emma barely noticed. All she could think about was Ethan, the boy who had changed her life, and who was now, officially, her son. Back at the hospital, Emma found Ethan resting peacefully after his surgery, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. She sat beside him, gently brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You're officially mine now," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. The relief, the joy, the overwhelming sense of love, it all hit her at once. After everything they had been through, the fear, the doubt, the pain, they had made it to the other side. Ethan was hers, and she was his. It was a bond that no court, no obstacle, could ever break. As the days passed, Ethan's health slowly began to improve. The surgery had been a success, and with time, he would be able to live a normal, happy life. Emma knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. They were a family now, and together, they would face whatever came next. The future, once filled with uncertainty, now held a sense of possibility that Emma hadn't felt in years. Life on the farm had taken on a new rhythm in the weeks following Ethan's surgery and the court's final decision. The quiet, once a painful reminder of all that Emma had lost, now felt peaceful again. With Ethan by her side, the house no longer felt empty. Laughter echoed through the halls, and the once dormant rooms were filled with warmth and joy. Emma found herself smiling more, the heaviness in her heart gradually lifting as she watched Ethan recover and thrive. They were building something new, something beautiful, out of the ashes of the past. Emma used part of her inheritance to make sure Ethan had everything he needed, his medical care, his schooling, and even small things that brought him joy. She enrolled him in a local school, where he quickly made friends, and soon the boy who had once been so fragile was running around the farm with energy and enthusiasm. Every day, Emma would watch him, amazed at the resilience he had shown. The fear of losing him, the battles they had fought, seemed like a distant memory as she saw how far they had come. Though the grief for Mike still lingered in her heart, it no longer consumed her. She had found a way to honor his memory by caring for the child he had kept secret, a boy who had become the light of her life. In the quiet moments, Emma would sit on the porch, looking out over the fields, and reflect on how much had changed. She had been through so much, but she had survived. And more than that, she had found a reason to live fully again. Ethan's laughter, his smiles, were a constant reminder of that. Their days were filled with simple joys, working in the garden, walking by the river, and spending evenings watching the stars. Emma had built a life with Ethan that was rich in love and connection, something she never could have imagined in the dark days following Mike's death. The farm, once a place of sorrow, had transformed into a home full of life. Every corner of it now held new memories, moments of happiness shared between mother and son. As the seasons changed, so did Emma. She no longer felt weighed down by the past, but rather strengthened by the journey she had taken. She had found healing in the most unexpected of places, in the love of a boy who had once been a stranger, but who was now her son. And as she looked toward the future, Emma knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she and Ethan would face them together, stronger than ever before. As the sun began to set over the rolling hills, Emma stood on the porch, watching Ethan run across the field, his laughter echoing in the evening air. The golden light bathed the landscape in warmth, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Ethan's energy and joy were contagious, a stark contrast to the quiet grief that had once filled the farm. Emma smiled, feeling the peace she had longed for finally settle in her heart. The life she had built with Ethan was full of love, hope, and the promise of a future she had never imagined. As she watched Ethan chase after the birds fluttering above, Emma realized just how far they had come. The secrets, the pain, the loss, they were all part of their story, but they no longer defined it. Instead, what defined their lives now was the love they shared, a bond that had grown stronger through every trial they faced. The sound of Ethan's laughter carried on the wind, filling the air with a sense of freedom. Emma knew that, no matter what came next, they would face it together, as a family. And in that moment, she felt whole.